England, 1815. For 10 years, Cordelia Ashworth had been the family secret, hidden away in the east wing of Ashworth Manor, while her beautiful half-sister Seraphina claimed every privilege that should have been hers. Lady Constance had convinced society that Cordelia was touched in the mind, too delicate for company, her face too unfortunate for polite gatherings. Behind ill-fitting gowns and thick spectacles, Cordelia tended her late mother's roses in solitude, believing herself as plain and unremarkable as everyone claimed. Until the night Lysander Blackwood, Duke of Ravensholm, heard mysterious music drifting through the darkness and followed it to discover the most extraordinary woman he had ever encountered. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning mist clung to the grimy window panes of Ashworth Manor's east wing like a shroud, distorting the world beyond into shapes that seemed more dream than reality. Cordelia Ashworth pressed her fingertips against the cold glass, watching the droplets of condensation trace lazy paths downward as she gazed upon her mother's rose garden below. At 24, she had grown accustomed to viewing life through barriers, whether they were windows that had not been properly cleaned in years, spectacles that fogged with the slightest change in temperature, or the heavy brown wool dress that hung upon her slender frame like a sack meant for grain rather than a garment designed for a lady. The dress had been deliberately chosen by her stepmother, Lady Constance, from among the servants' cast-offs, altered just enough to avoid scandal should anyone of consequence glimpse Cordelia in the corridors, yet tailored poorly enough to disguise any hint of the graceful figure that lay beneath. Her lustrous auburn hair, which had once caught sunlight like spun copper and drawn admiring glances from the village children, was now ruthlessly confined beneath a cap of such severe design and dingy colours that it seemed to drain all warmth from her delicate features. The spectacles perched upon her nose were unnecessary for her vision, which was as sharp as her mind, but Lady Constance had insisted upon them years ago, claiming they would help with Cordelia's supposed nervous condition and delicate constitution. The roses below swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their blooms long since faded, but their stems still strong, still reaching toward a sun that seemed perpetually obscured by the grime and neglect that shrouded this forgotten corner of the manor. Cordelia knew each plant intimately, had tended them in secret through the changing seasons, whispering to them as her mother once had, sharing with them the dreams and longings she dared not voice to any human soul. Lady Margaret Ashworth had planted this garden with her own hands in the early days of her marriage, when love still flourished between her and Sir Reginald, before illness had taken her strength and finally her life, leaving her daughter to face the world alone and unprotected. The irony was not lost on Cordelia that she, like her mother's roses, continued to grow and thrive despite neglect, finding sustenance in whatever scraps of sunlight managed to penetrate the shadows that had been her world for the past 10 years. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor outside her chamber, and Cordelia turned from the window with practiced swiftness, settling herself at the small wooden table where she kept her botanical journals and correspondence. Mrs. Pemberton entered without ceremony, her round face flushed with exertion and her greying hair escaping from beneath her starched cap, in wisps that spoke of a morning spent in frantic preparation. The housekeeper had been Cordelia's mother's personal maid before her marriage, and remained the only soul in Ashworth Manor who remembered when Cordelia had been the cherished daughter of the house, rather than the shameful secret hidden away in its forgotten corners. "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton," Cordelia said softly, her voice carrying the refined accents of her gentle birth, despite years of isolation, though she had learned to speak quietly, for loud voices drew unwanted attention and unwanted attention brought punishment in the form of longer periods of confinement. "I trust the household is well this morning." The older woman's expression was grave as she closed the door behind her and approached the table where Cordelia sat with careful composure. "Miss Cordelia," she said, using the title that Lady Constance had forbidden, but which Mrs. Pemberton stubbornly maintained in private, "I bring news that will require your utmost discretion and care. Your sister's engagement celebration is to take place this very evening, and there will be guests in the manor, distinguished guests who must not catch so much as a glimpse of you." Cordelia's hands stilled upon the pages of her journal, where she had been recording observations about the late-blooming varieties that had surprised her with their resilience in the face of the season's early frost. "Seraphina's engagement," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral, despite the pang that shot through her heart at the reminder of all she had been denied. "To Lord Theodore Harrington, I assume. The match her ladyship has been pursuing so ardently these past months." Mrs. Pemberton nodded grimly. Her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of years of watching injustice unfold without the power to prevent it. "The very same, and a fine catch he is by all accounts, though I wonder what he would think if he knew the true state of affairs in this house. But that is neither here nor there, child. What matters now is that you must remain completely hidden until the last guest has departed tomorrow morning. Lady Constance has given strict instructions to all the staff, and she has made it clear that any servant who so much as mentions your existence will be dismissed without reference." Cordelia nodded with the resigned grace that had become her armor against the casual cruelties of her daily existence, though she could not entirely suppress the bitter irony that her own sister's greatest triumph required her complete erasure from the world. "It was ever thus, Mrs. Pemberton," she said quietly, closing the journal with hands that trembled only slightly. "I have become quite accomplished at being invisible, have I not? Perhaps it is for the best, for I would not wish to cast a shadow upon Seraphina's happiness with my unsuitable presence." The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, for she had learned long ago that displays of emotion only made matters worse for the gentle girl she had helped to raise. "Oh, my dear child," she whispered, reaching out to touch Cordelia's hand with fingers work-worn from years of faithful service. "If your dear mother could see what has become of you, hidden away like some shameful secret when you should be the belle of London society, it would break her heart anew. You have her beauty, though they have tried to hide it, and her intelligence, though they pretend you are simple, and her gentle spirit, though they would have the world believe you are mad. Lady Margaret was the finest woman I ever knew, and you are her daughter in every way that matters, despite what your stepmother would have people believe." Cordelia squeezed the older woman's hand gratefully, drawing strength from this small act of rebellion against the narrative that had been constructed around her life. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," she said with curiosity that no amount of isolation had been able to diminish, "what manner of guests are expected for this grand celebration? Are they all from Seraphina's usual circle of admirers, or has Lady Constance managed to attract more elevated company to witness her daughter's triumph?" The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how much to reveal, for she had learned that knowledge could be both a gift and a burden to one whose life was so constrained. "There are to be several families from the county," she said carefully, "and Lord Theodore's parents, naturally, along with his sister Lady Beatrice, who is said to be quite accomplished and independent in her thinking. But there have been some unexpected developments that have set the household into quite a flutter, for it seems that circumstances may bring additional guests who were not part of the original invitation." She paused, as if weighing whether to continue, then seemed to reach a decision that brought a slight smile to her lined face. "There are rumors," she said in a conspiratorial whisper, "that the Duke of Ravensholm himself may be in the vicinity, travelling to his estates in the north. And if that proves to be the case, Lady Constance will move heaven and earth to secure his attendance at tonight's festivities." Cordelia's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, for even in her isolation she had heard whispers of the mysterious Duke, who was said to be both devastatingly handsome and impossibly reclusive, a man who attended few social functions and was rumoured to have spurned every matchmaking attempt made by ambitious mothers throughout England. "The Shadow Duke," she murmured, using the epithet that had followed Lysander Blackwood through every drawing-room and gentleman's club in London. "They say he is more myth than man, so rarely does he appear in society. What could possibly draw such a figure to our humble county gathering?" Mrs. Pemberton shrugged with the practical wisdom of one who had observed the workings of fate for many years. "Who can say what forces move such great men?" she replied. "Perhaps it is mere coincidence, or perhaps there are currents in the world that we simple folk cannot perceive. What I do know is that Lady Constance has been in such a state of nervous excitement since the possibility was mentioned that she has had the entire household turned upside down in preparation, as though the Prince Regent himself were expected to grace our halls." The afternoon passed slowly for Cordelia, who found herself unusually restless as the sounds of preparation echoed through the manor below. She attempted to lose herself in her correspondence, carefully crafting responses to the botanical societies that had unknowingly welcomed her contributions under the masculine pseudonym she had adopted years ago when she first began to share her observations and theories about plant cultivation and hybridization. The irony was not lost on her that her mind was valued and respected by learned men across England, even as her own family treated her as though she possessed neither intelligence nor worth. Her sketches, too, provided some distraction, as she worked to capture the delicate structure of a dried flower specimen that had caught her attention during her last secret venture into the garden. Yet, despite her efforts to maintain her usual routine, Cordelia found her thoughts returning again and again to the possibility that she might catch a glimpse of the legendary Duke of Ravensholm, this man whose reputation for mystery and reclusiveness had captured the imagination of society, even as his avoidance of it had frustrated every ambitious mother with marriageable daughters. As evening approached and the sounds of arriving carriages began to filter up from the main drive, Cordelia positioned herself carefully at her window, taking care to remain in the shadows where she could observe without being observed. She watched as elegant couples emerged from their conveyances, the ladies resplendent in silks and jewels that caught the light of the torches that had been lit along the entrance, the gentlemen equally fine in their evening attire as they offered their arms to escort their companions into the warmth and light of the manor's grand reception rooms. Seraphina appeared briefly in the doorway, and even from her distant vantage point, Cordelia could see that her half-sister had indeed inherited their father's conventional prettiness, with golden curls arranged in the height of fashion and a gown of pale blue silk that emphasized her youth and freshness. Lord Theodore stood beside his betrothed, a pleasant-looking gentleman whose unremarkable features were nevertheless animated by obvious satisfaction at having secured such a beautiful bride, and Cordelia felt a pang of something that was not quite envy, but rather a deep longing for the simple human connection that had been denied to her for so many years. Yet it was not until a final carriage approached, moving with an elegance that spoke of superior craftsmanship, and drawn by horses whose breeding was evident even in the uncertain light of dusk, that Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat, and her hands grip the window-sill with sudden intensity. For as the door opened and its occupant stepped down onto the gravel drive, she knew with absolute certainty that she was looking upon the Duke of Ravensholm himself, and that all the whispered descriptions had failed utterly to capture the reality of his presence, the way he seemed to command the very air around him with an authority that was born not of title alone, but of character and intelligence, and a power that was entirely his own. The last notes of Mozart's sonata in A major hung in the air like silver threads, weaving through the silence of the abandoned music room with a poignancy that seemed to transform the very dust motes dancing in the moonbeams, streaming through the tall windows. Lysander Blackwood stood motionless in the doorway, his hand still resting upon the brass handle as he absorbed the extraordinary performance he had just witnessed. Though witnessed was perhaps too strong a word for what had occurred in the near darkness of this forgotten corner of Ashworth Manor. He had been unable to sleep, his mind too restless after the evening's peculiar dinner conversation, where every word had seemed calculated, every smile rehearsed, every gesture designed to impress rather than express genuine feeling. The Duke had excused himself from the drawing-room, where Lord Theodore was regaling the assembled company with hunting stories of dubious veracity, while Seraphina hung upon his every word with the sort of adoring attention that seemed more performed than felt, and Lady Constance orchestrated the entire scene with the skill of a master puppeteer pulling invisible strings. Something about the household had struck him as fundamentally wrong, though he could not yet articulate the nature of his unease, only that beneath the surface of conventional propriety lay currents of deception that his instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of both business and society, detected with increasing certainty. The music he had followed through the darkened corridors had been like a beacon of authenticity in a house that seemed built upon lies, each note played with such profound understanding of the composer's intentions that the performer clearly possessed both technical mastery and the sort of deep emotional intelligence that could transform mere notes upon a page into pure feeling made audible. The figure seated at the pianoforte remained perfectly still, as though the act of playing had transported her to some realm where earthly concerns could not intrude, and in the dim light cast by a single candelabra placed upon the instrument's polished surface, Lysander could discern only the graceful curve of her neck, the elegant line of her shoulders, and the way her fingers rested upon the keys as though they belonged there by divine right rather than mere training. "Do not stop on my account," he said softly, his deep voice carefully modulated to convey appreciation rather than intrusion. For he had learned long ago that sudden movements or loud sounds could shatter delicate moments like crystal dropped upon stone. That was beautifully played, with an understanding of Mozart that I rarely hear even in the finest London salons. Please, continue if you wish, for I find myself quite enchanted by your interpretation. The young woman's shoulders tensed slightly at his words, and he could sense her surprise and perhaps alarm at being discovered in what was clearly a private moment, yet she did not flee as he half expected she might. Instead, after a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she spoke in a voice that was cultured and melodious, though kept deliberately low as though she feared being overheard by others beyond the music room's confines. "You are too kind, sir," she replied, her words carrying an accent that spoke of gentle birth and excellent education, despite the simplicity of her dress and the severe styling of her hair that he could glimpse in profile. "I fear I am merely an adequate amateur whose enthusiasm exceeds her skill, though I confess that music has been my greatest solace during times when other pleasures were denied me. Mozart's genius lies in his ability to speak to the human heart with mathematical precision, do you not think? Each note serves both emotional and architectural purposes, creating structures of sound that mirror the complexities of feeling itself." Lysander found himself moving closer to the pianoforte, drawn by the unexpected sophistication of her observation and the melodious quality of her voice that seemed to resonate with something deep within his chest. "Your analysis demonstrates far more than mere enthusiasm," he replied with genuine interest, for he had spent countless evenings in drawing rooms where young ladies performed dutiful pieces with mechanical precision, but no real understanding of the music's deeper meaning. You speak of Mozart's mathematical precision with the insight of someone who truly comprehends the relationship between structure and emotion in musical composition. Have you studied music theory, or do these observations spring from your own intuitive understanding? The question seemed to surprise her, for she turned slightly in his direction, though the candlelight still kept her features largely in shadow, creating an air of mystery that intrigued him far more than the calculated coquetry he had endured during dinner. "I have had no formal instruction, sir," she admitted with what sounded like wistful longing, "though I have read whatever treatises I could obtain and spent countless hours analyzing the compositions that came into my possession. Music theory fascinates me because it reveals how order and passion can coexist, how the most transcendent emotions can be channeled through precise mathematical relationships to create something that speaks to the soul while satisfying the mind's need for logical progression. Do you find in your own experience that the greatest art emerges from this marriage of intellect and feeling rather than from either alone?" Her question revealed not only intelligence, but genuine curiosity about his opinions, a refreshing change from the simpering agreement or calculated disagreement he typically encountered from young ladies seeking to capture his attention through conversational manipulation. "I believe you have identified something essential about the nature of artistic achievement," Lysander replied thoughtfully, settling himself into a chair positioned near the pianoforte where he could observe her profile without seeming to scrutinize her too closely. The greatest composers, painters, and poets seem to possess both technical mastery and emotional depth, using their understanding of formal principles to serve their expressive purposes rather than allowing technique to become an end in itself. Yet I would argue that what you call intuitive understanding may actually represent a form of natural genius that formal education often fails to cultivate, for I have met many highly trained musicians who could execute the most complex passages flawlessly, yet never moved me as your playing has done tonight. Tell me, what draws you particularly to Mozart? Do you find his work more satisfying than that of other composers?" The young woman was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving absently over the keys without depressing them, creating ghostly echoes of melodies in the silence. "Mozart speaks to me because his music contains such profound humanity," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of deep feeling that suggested personal experience of the emotions she described. Even his most joyful pieces contain acknowledgement of life's sorrows, while his most tragic compositions never lose sight of beauty's persistence in the face of suffering. I find in his work a reflection of my own understanding that joy and sadness are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of the human experience, each giving meaning and depth to the other. Perhaps that is why his music provides such comfort during difficult periods, for it reminds me that even in isolation and disappointment, one can still touch something transcendent through art and imagination. There was such poignant honesty in her words that Lysander felt a stirring of protective instinct he had not experienced since his youth, combined with admiration for her philosophical sophistication and the gentle courage required to find solace in beauty, despite what sounded like significant personal trials. Their conversation continued for perhaps an hour, ranging across topics from literature to philosophy, with a freedom and intellectual equality that Lysander had rarely experienced even among his male acquaintances, let alone in discourse with a young lady of apparent refinement. She demonstrated familiarity with classical authors, insightful observations about contemporary poetry, and an understanding of natural philosophy that suggested extensive self-education pursued with genuine passion rather than mere social accomplishment. Yet throughout their exchange, she maintained her position at the pianoforte, with her back largely turned toward him, and he began to suspect that this positioning was deliberate rather than coincidental, as though she sought to preserve some form of anonymity even within their intimate conversation. When he mentioned admiring the rose garden he had glimpsed from his chamber window, she spoke with sudden animation about botanical cultivation and the properties of various species, revealing knowledge that could only have come from extensive hands-on experience combined with serious study of horticultural principles. It was during this discussion that the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern windows, and the young woman seemed suddenly to become aware of the passing time and perhaps the impropriety of her situation. "I must go," she said with obvious reluctance, rising from the piano bench with graceful haste and moving toward a side door that apparently led to the servants' quarters or lesser passages of the manor. "It has been a privilege to speak with someone who shares my appreciation for music and learning, sir, but I fear I have imposed upon your kindness far too long already." "Wait," Lysander called softly, rising from his chair with the intention of detaining her long enough to learn her identity, for the thought of losing contact with this remarkable woman without even knowing her name seemed suddenly unbearable. "Please, I would very much like to continue our conversation when circumstances permit, but I do not even know by what name I might inquire after you." But his words were spoken to empty air, for she had vanished through the doorway with a swiftness that suggested intimate familiarity with the manor's hidden passages, leaving him standing alone in the music room with only the lingering scent of roses and the echo of her melodious voice to prove that their extraordinary encounter had been real rather than some dream conjured by his restless imagination. Yet as he stood there in the growing light of dawn, Lysander found himself more intrigued and intellectually stimulated than he had been in years, his mind already planning how he might engineer another meeting with this mysterious woman who combined musical talent, philosophical depth, and a poignant vulnerability that had touched something in his heart he had thought permanently guarded against such influence. The silhouette he had glimpsed as she departed suggested a figure of uncommon grace despite her simple dress, and her voice had possessed a sweetness that no amount of education could manufacture, leading him to conclude that beneath whatever circumstances kept her hidden in the shadows of this household lay a woman of exceptional qualities who deserved far better than the obscurity that seemed to be her current fate. As he made his way back to his own chambers through corridors that seemed somehow different in the wake of their encounter, the Duke of Ravensholm found himself looking forward to the day ahead with an anticipation he had not felt since his youth, when the world had still seemed full of possibilities for genuine connection and meaningful discovery. The morning brought curious developments that only deepened the mystery surrounding his nocturnal encounter, for when Lysander made subtle inquiries about the household's musical talents during breakfast, he was met with responses that seemed designed more to obscure than illuminate the truth. Lady Constance claimed with emphatic pride that only dear Seraphina possessed any musical accomplishments worth mentioning, though the young lady's performance the previous evening had been merely adequate at best and demonstrated none of the profound understanding or technical mastery he had witnessed in the music room. When he mentioned hearing someone play Mozart with exceptional skill during his midnight wanderings, Sir Reginald grew visibly nervous and hastily changed the subject to hunting prospects in the local countryside, while Lady Constance insisted rather too forcefully that no such performance could have taken place, as all the family and servants had been abed at that hour. The denial was so vehement, and the discomfort it generated so palpable, that Lysander became certain he had stumbled upon some carefully guarded secret, though the nature of that secret remained tantalizingly beyond his grasp. Seraphina herself seemed genuinely puzzled by his questions, suggesting that whatever deception was being practiced, she was not its primary architect, which pointed to her parents as the orchestrators of whatever elaborate charade was being maintained to keep his mysterious musician hidden from view. The Duke's suspicions were further aroused when he noticed how carefully the conversation was steered away from any mention of other residents in the manor, how servants seemed to avoid his direct gaze when he made inquiries about the household's composition, and how certain areas of the East Wing were apparently off-limits to guests, despite his host's otherwise expansive hospitality. The portrait gallery of Ashworth Manor stretched before Lysander like a testament to generations of family pride, its walls lined with painted ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow his movements as he made his way slowly down the corridor, ostensibly admiring the artistic heritage of his hosts, while in reality conducting a careful investigation into the mysteries that surrounded this household like morning mist. The formal dinner had concluded with the usual rituals of port and cigars for the gentlemen and tea and gossip for the ladies, but Lysander had excused himself early, claiming a desire to appreciate the manor's collection of family portraits by candlelight, when in truth he hoped to discover some clue to the identity of the remarkable woman who had so captivated his thoughts and imagination during their brief encounters. Each painting told its own story of prosperity and social standing, from stern-faced patriarchs in elaborate wigs to demure matrons surrounded by symbols of their domestic virtues, yet none prepared him for the shock of recognition that struck him like a physical blow when his gaze fell upon a particular portrait positioned in a place of honor near the gallery's center. The woman depicted there possessed an ethereal beauty that transcended the conventional prettiness favored by fashionable portraitists, her delicate features combining strength and softness in a way that spoke of both noble breeding and genuine character, while her eyes held depths of intelligence and compassion that the artist had somehow managed to capture with remarkable skill. But it was not merely the subject's beauty that caused Lysander's breath to catch in his throat and his hand to tighten involuntarily upon the silver-headed walking stick he carried, for the resemblance between this painted lady and the mysterious young woman he had encountered in both the music-room and the rose garden was so striking as to be unmistakable, though the figure in the portrait wore jewels and silks befitting her obvious station, while his mysterious musician had been dressed in the simple garb of a servant or poor relation. The nameplate affixed to the ornate gold frame confirmed what his instincts had already suggested, reading in elegant script, Lady Margaret Ashworth, beloved wife and mother, followed by dates that indicated she had died some 10 years previously at the tragically young age of 34, leaving behind what must have been a daughter who had inherited not only her mother's extraordinary beauty, but also her musical talents and intellectual gifts. The soft sound of approaching footsteps caused Lysander to turn from his contemplation of the portrait, and he was not entirely surprised to see Mrs. Pemberton emerging from the shadows at the gallery's far end, her expression grave and thoughtful as she approached him with the careful gait of one who had spent years moving through the manor's corridors without attracting unwanted attention. "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice carrying the sort of respectful formality that nevertheless suggested she had something of importance to communicate. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I could not help but notice your interest in Lady Margaret's portrait, and I find myself wondering if perhaps you have questions that deserve honest answers rather than the evasions you have been offered thus far." Lysander studied the housekeeper's lined face with the penetrating gaze that had served him well in countless business negotiations and social encounters, recognizing in her steady expression the hallmarks of integrity and loyalty that had become increasingly rare in his experience of the world. "Mrs. Pemberton," he replied with careful courtesy, "I confess that I am indeed curious about certain aspects of this household that seem to contradict the information I have been given by my hosts, and if you are willing to enlighten me, I would be grateful for any illumination you might provide regarding matters that appear to involve deliberate deception." The older woman nodded slowly, as though she had been weighing this decision throughout the day, and had finally reached a conclusion that satisfied both her conscience and her sense of duty to those she served. "What I am about to tell you, Your Grace," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "must remain in the strictest confidence, for there are lives at stake and consequences that could prove devastating if my trust in your discretion proves misplaced. Yet I find I can no longer remain silent in the face of injustices that grow more grievous with each passing year. Lady Margaret's daughter lives," she continued, her eyes never leaving his face as she gauged his reaction to this revelation, though she has been hidden away like some shameful secret for the past decade, kept prisoner in her own home by a stepmother whose ambitions require the complete erasure of any rival to her own daughter's prospects. The confirmation of what Lysander had already begun to suspect struck him with a mixture of satisfaction at his deductive abilities and outrage at the cruelty such a situation implied, for to hide away a young woman of obvious breeding and accomplishments suggested a level of calculated malice that offended his sense of justice as much as it explained the atmosphere of deception that permeated the manor like a poisonous vapor. "You speak of the young woman I encountered in the music room last night," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger that burned within his chest at the thought of such systematic abuse. And again this morning in the rose garden, where her knowledge and cultivation clearly exceeded anything that could be attributed to mere casual interest in horticulture. Mrs. Pemberton nodded with obvious relief at his understanding, her shoulders relaxing slightly, as though the burden of secrecy had grown too heavy to bear alone. "Miss Cordelia is Sir Reginald's legitimate daughter and the rightful heir to half of this estate," she explained, her voice growing stronger as she committed herself fully to this dangerous confession. As well as inheritor of her mother's substantial dowry and properties, that would make her one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the county if she were permitted to claim her rightful inheritance. But Lady Constance has spent 10 years systematically destroying her stepdaughter's prospects through manipulation and lies, convincing Sir Reginald that his own child inherited her mother's supposed weak constitution and nervous disposition, conditions that required constant supervision and protection from the corrupting influences of society. What began as temporary isolation following Lady Margaret's death has gradually transformed into complete imprisonment, with Cordelia's very existence denied to the outside world, while her half-sister enjoys every privilege and opportunity that should by rights be shared between them. Lysander felt a cold fury building within him as the full scope of Lady Constance's machinations became clear, recognizing in her tactics the sort of systematic psychological manipulation he had witnessed in his own family's twisted dynamics, where power and position were pursued through the deliberate destruction of those who stood in the way of ambition. "Tell me everything," he commanded with quiet intensity, his aristocratic bearing lending weight to words that might have seemed presumptuous from a man of lesser standing. "For I find myself deeply concerned for Miss Cordelia's welfare and disposed to take whatever action might be necessary to remedy this intolerable situation." Mrs. Pemberton glanced nervously toward the gallery's entrances, ensuring they remained unobserved, before continuing her revelations with the desperate urgency of one who had waited years for an opportunity to speak truth to someone with the power to act upon it. "The isolation began gradually," she explained, with Lady Constance suggesting that poor Cordelia was too delicate for the rough play of other children, too sensitive for the noise and excitement of social gatherings, too refined for the coarse manners of local society. Sir Reginald, devastated by grief and guilt over his late wife's death, accepted these assessments without question, particularly as his new bride demonstrated such apparent concern for his daughter's welfare and such skill in managing the household's complex social obligations. But as Cordelia grew from child to young woman and her resemblance to her beautiful mother became undeniable, Lady Constance's protective measures became increasingly restrictive until the girl found herself confined to the east wing of the manor with only myself and a handful of loyal servants for company, her very existence a secret known only to the household staff, who had been threatened with immediate dismissal should they reveal her presence to any outside party. The cruel irony, Mrs. Pemberton continued with obvious pain, is that Miss Cordelia possesses every accomplishment that should make her the toast of London society. From her musical talents and artistic abilities to her extensive self-education in subjects ranging from literature and philosophy to natural sciences and estate management, yet all of these gifts have been hidden away like buried treasure, while her half-sister, who possesses neither beauty nor intellect in equal measure, enjoys the recognition and opportunities that should belong to both young ladies. The systematic nature of the abuse became even clearer as Mrs. Pemberton described how Lady Constance had gradually assumed control over Cordelia's inheritance through her influence over Sir Reginald, convincing him that his daughter's supposed fragile mental state made her unsuitable for the responsibilities of managing her own affairs, while simultaneously ensuring that no outside parties had opportunity to assess Cordelia's actual condition or capabilities through direct observation. Several suitors had indeed made inquiries about the Ashworth daughters over the years, Mrs. Pemberton revealed, including some gentlemen of considerable standing who had heard rumours of Lady Margaret's beautiful daughter and hoped to make her acquaintance, but Lady Constance had turned them all away with explanations about Cordelia's delicate health and unsuitability for the demands of marriage and social position. The most tragic aspect of the situation, the housekeeper continued with tears beginning to gather in her eyes, is that Miss Cordelia has gradually come to believe many of the lies told about her own nature and worth, accepting her isolation as necessary protection for others rather than recognizing it as the cruel imprisonment it truly represents. She speaks of herself as plain and unremarkable, though she possesses beauty that surpasses her half-sister's conventional prettiness, and describes her intelligence as merely adequate, though her learning exceeds that of most gentlemen of my acquaintance, for she has been so systematically convinced of her own inadequacy that she cannot see herself as others would see her if given the opportunity. Yet I have observed changes in her demeanour since your arrival, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton added, with something approaching hope in her expression, for your interest in her conversation and accomplishments has awakened something in her spirit that has been dormant for too many years, reminding her that she possesses worth beyond what her stepmother would have her believe. If there is any possibility that a gentleman of your standing and influence might find a way to remedy this terrible injustice, I beg you to consider taking action, for Miss Cordelia deserves the chance to live the life that should have been hers by right of birth and character, rather than remaining forever hidden in the shadows of her stepmother's ambitions. Lysander stood in thoughtful silence for several moments after Mrs. Pemberton concluded her revelations, his mind already working through the legal and social implications of what he had learned, while his heart burned with determination to rescue Cordelia from the web of deception and control that had trapped her for so many years. The situation stirred memories of his own youth, when his father's cruelties had taught him to recognize the particular species of evil that flourished in households where power was concentrated in the hands of those willing to destroy others for personal advantage, and he felt the familiar stirring of protective instincts that had led him to become guardian and advocate for those whom society overlooked or dismissed. "Miss Pemberton," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command, "I give you my word as a gentleman that everything you have told me will be treated with the utmost discretion, and I further promise that I will use every resource at my disposal to investigate Miss Cordelia's legal standing and explore what options might be available to restore her rightful position in society. The systematic abuse you have described is not merely cruel but illegal, For no adult woman of sound mind should be held prisoner by her family, regardless of their stated intentions. And if Miss Cordelia is indeed the intelligent and capable person our brief acquaintances suggest, then she has every right to control her own destiny and inheritance without interference from those who would manipulate her for their own benefit. You have shown remarkable courage in speaking truthfully about these matters, he continued, with genuine respect for the older woman's loyalty and integrity, and I hope you will continue to serve as Miss Cordelia's advocate and protector while I determine the best course of action to remedy this intolerable situation, for she will need allies within the household as circumstances develop and the truth of her situation becomes more widely known. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rose garden as Lysander made his way through the carefully tended paths, ostensibly taking his customary walk, while in reality keeping a predetermined appointment that had become the brightest part of each day since Mrs. Pemberton had begun facilitating these carefully orchestrated encounters between himself and the remarkable young woman who had captured both his imagination and his heart. 3 weeks had passed since the housekeeper had revealed the truth of Cordelia's situation. And in that time they had managed to establish a routine of meetings that appeared accidental to any casual observer, yet provided precious opportunities for conversation and companionship that had gradually transformed both participants in ways that neither had anticipated when their alliance first began. Mrs. Pemberton had proven herself an invaluable co-conspirator in their campaign to restore some measure of normal social interaction to Cordelia's constrained existence, arranging for properly fitted clothing to be delivered to her chamber under the guise of necessary repairs to her existing wardrobe, smuggling books and periodicals from Lysander's own extensive traveling library to supplement her reading materials, and creating opportunities for the Duke to encounter Cordelia in settings where their conversations could unfold naturally without the awkwardness of obvious deception. The transformation in Miss Ashworth had been nothing short of remarkable, as though some essential part of her spirit had been gradually awakening from the dormancy imposed by years of systematic suppression and isolation, revealing layers of intelligence, wit, and grace that had been buried beneath the careful disguises her stepmother had constructed to hide her true nature from the world, and perhaps even from herself. This morning, Cordelia awaited him beside the climbing roses that had been her mother's particular pride, and the sight of her caused Lysander's breath to catch in his throat, as it did each time he encountered her in the improved circumstances their conspiracy had managed to create. The simple morning dress Mrs. Pemberton had somehow procured fit her slender figure properly, revealing the elegant lines that had been hidden beneath ill-fitting garments for so many years, while her lustrous auburn hair had been arranged in a style that flattered her delicate features without the severe constraint of the unflattering cap that had previously concealed its beauty. More importantly, her violet blue eyes sparkled with animation and intelligence as she looked up from the botanical journal she had been consulting, her expression brightening with genuine pleasure at his approach in a way that sent warmth flooding through his chest and reminded him daily why he had become so thoroughly captivated by this extraordinary woman who combined remarkable intellectual gifts with a sweetness of character that no amount of mistreatment had been able to corrupt. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, with the natural grace that had emerged more clearly as her confidence grew, "though I fear you may find me rather poor company today, for I have been struggling with a particularly challenging passage in Linnaeus regarding the classification of hybrid rose varieties, and my inadequate Latin has proven quite frustrating to my attempts at comprehension." Her self-deprecating comment about her linguistic abilities caused Lysander to smile, for he had discovered over the course of their conversations that Cordelia's education, though self-directed, was remarkably comprehensive, and that her supposed inadequacies were merely the result of having no formal instruction to guide her studies rather than any lack of intellectual capacity or dedication to learning. Miss Ashworth, Lysander replied with the warmth that had gradually replaced the formal courtesy of their early encounters. I suspect your Latin is far superior to that of most gentlemen of my acquaintance, and I would be delighted to assist with any troublesome passages if you would permit me to examine the text in question, for I have found that collaborative translation often reveals nuances that escape solitary effort. Moreover, he continued as he settled himself on the stone bench that had become their customary meeting place, I brought you something that may interest you, though I confess I am somewhat nervous about your reaction to my presumption in offering it. From his coat he withdrew a leather-bound volume that bore the prestigious imprint of the Royal Horticultural Society, its pages crisp and new with the distinctive smell of fresh ink and fine paper that marked it as a recent publication of considerable importance to those interested in botanical studies. Cordelia's eyes widened with surprise and delight as she recognized the significance of the gift, her fingers tracing the embossed title with reverence that spoke of her genuine appreciation for scholarship and learning. Your Grace, she breathed. This is the latest collection of papers from the Society's annual proceedings, but surely such a valuable volume should remain in your own library rather than being given to someone who can offer nothing in return for such generosity. Her protest caused Lysander to lean forward with sudden intensity, his grey eyes searching her face as he spoke with conviction that surprised them both with its fervour. Miss Ashworth, he said earnestly, you consistently underestimate your own worth in a manner that breaks my heart, for you have already given me more through our conversations and companionship than any book could possibly represent, and I would consider it the greatest honor if you would accept this small token of my esteem and appreciation for the intellectual stimulation and genuine pleasure your society has brought to my life. Furthermore, he continued with a smile that held hints of mischief alongside affection, I have particular reasons for believing that this volume will be of special interest to you, for it contains several papers on rose cultivation that I suspect may seem remarkably familiar when you examine them closely. Cordelia opened the book with careful reverence, her slender fingers turning pages with the practiced care of one who truly valued books as treasures rather than mere objects. And as she reached the section devoted to botanical studies, her expression changed from general interest to shock, and then to something approaching wonder as she encountered her own work presented in the formal setting of scholarly publication. My article on hybrid tea roses, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at the printed pages that transformed her careful observations and theories into permanent scholarly record. But how did you discover that I was the author when I submitted it under the name of C.A. Sheffield? Lysander felt a surge of pride on her behalf as he witnessed her amazement at seeing her intellectual contributions recognized and validated by the scholarly community, even as he recognized the poignancy of her surprise that anyone would take the trouble to uncover her identity or acknowledge her accomplishments. I have extensive connections within various learned societies, he explained gently, and when I became curious about the impressive series of papers that had been appearing under that particular pseudonym, I made discreet inquiries that eventually led me to the truth of their authorship, though I confess I was hardly surprised to discover that the brilliant mind behind those observations belonged to the remarkable woman whose conversation has so thoroughly captivated my attention. Your work has been praised by some of the most respected authorities in botanical studies, Miss Ashworth, and your theories regarding cross-pollination techniques have influenced cultivation practices throughout England. Yet here you sit in enforced isolation, believing yourself to be of little worth or intelligence, when in reality you have achieved more scholarly recognition than most university-trained gentlemen manage in entire lifetimes. The tears that gathered in Cordelia's eyes were clearly tears of joy rather than sorrow, though they contained complex emotions that spoke of years of believing herself inadequate and unremarkable. being suddenly challenged by evidence of genuine achievement and recognition that she had never imagined possible. "You have given me such a gift," she said softly, her voice trembling with feeling that she struggled to control. "Not merely this beautiful book, but the knowledge that my work has value beyond my own personal satisfaction, that perhaps I am not the useless creature Lady Constance has convinced me I must be if I am to justify the care and protection she claims to provide for my benefit. For so many years I have accepted that my interests and observations were merely the harmless pursuits of someone with too much time and too little understanding of my proper place in the world, never daring to hope that my thoughts might contribute something meaningful to human knowledge, or that anyone would consider my opinions worthy of serious consideration." The transformation in her demeanor as she spoke revealed how profoundly the isolation and systematic undermining of her confidence had affected her self-perception, yet also demonstrated the resilience and strength of character that had enabled her to pursue intellectual growth despite every discouragement and obstacle placed in her path. Their conversation continued for another hour as they examined the journal together, with Lysander pointing out not only her own contributions, but also references to her work in papers written by other scholars, creating a growing picture of her influence within the botanical community that filled him with admiration for her achievements and fury at the system that had kept such talents hidden from the world that could benefit from them. As they discussed the implications of various research findings and debated theoretical questions with the easy familiarity that had developed between them, Lysander found himself marveling once again at the depth of her knowledge and the sophistication of her analytical thinking, qualities that made their intellectual partnership as satisfying as their growing emotional connection had become precious to his formerly solitary existence. Yet even as he reveled in her company and took pleasure in witnessing her growing confidence and self-awareness, a part of his mind remained alert to the dangers that surrounded their clandestine relationship, for he had begun to notice signs that Lady Constance was growing suspicious of his frequent absences from the manor's public areas and his obvious lack of interest in the entertainments she arranged for his amusement. The delicate balance they had maintained between discretion and companionship was becoming increasingly precarious as their feelings deepened and their need for each other's society grew more difficult to disguise, creating pressures that threatened to expose their secret alliance and place Cordelia in greater danger than she had faced even during the long years of her enforced isolation. As they prepared to part for the morning, following the careful protocol Mrs. Pemberton had established to minimize the risk of discovery, Cordelia turned to him with an expression that combined gratitude with something deeper and more complex that made his pulse quicken with hope and protective tenderness. "Your Grace," she said hesitantly, as though weighing whether to give voice to thoughts that had clearly been troubling her, "I must ask whether you have considered the potential consequences of your kindness to me, for I have begun to fear that your interest in my welfare may create difficulties for you that I would never willingly cause, given how much your friendship has come to mean to my happiness and sense of worth. I am beginning to understand that my situation is not merely unfortunate, but actually quite scandalous when viewed from the perspective of proper society, and I worry that association with someone of my ambiguous status might reflect poorly upon your reputation or create complications in your own social standing that you have not fully anticipated." Her concern for his welfare, even at the potential cost of her own happiness, revealed the generous spirit that had captured his heart as thoroughly as her intelligence had engaged his mind. Yet it also demonstrated how thoroughly she had internalized the shame and stigma that Lady Constance had attached to her very existence, believing herself to be somehow tainted or dangerous to those who showed her kindness. "Miss Ashworth," Lysander replied with fierce conviction that surprised them both with its intensity, "I must insist that you banish such concerns from your thoughts immediately. for nothing in this world could be worth the loss of your companionship. And any society that would condemn a gentleman for recognizing and honoring genuine worth and virtue is not worthy of respect or consideration. You speak of potential damage to my reputation, as though I have not carefully weighed every aspect of our situation and chosen deliberately to pursue a course of action that aligns with my conscience and my heart, regardless of what small minds might think or say about my choices. Furthermore, he continued with growing passion, I would have you understand that far from considering you a burden or liability, I have come to regard our friendship as the greatest blessing of my adult life, a source of intellectual stimulation and emotional satisfaction that I had never dared hope to find. And I am prepared to face whatever consequences may arise from defending your interests and supporting your rightful place in the world. The day is coming, and sooner than you might imagine, when you will take your proper position in society as the accomplished and remarkable woman you have always been, despite every attempt to convince you otherwise. And when that day arrives, I intend to be standing beside you as your devoted advocate and, if you will permit it, something far more significant than merely a friend who happened to recognize your true worth when others remained blind to it. Lady Constance stood at her chamber window, her sharp eyes taking careful note of the Duke's absence from the morning room where he customarily took his breakfast, and her mind working through the implications of the pattern she had begun to detect in his behavior over the past several weeks. Something was amiss, she was certain, for a gentleman of the Duke's elevated social position did not spend quite so much time walking alone in gardens or taking solitary rides about the countryside without some purpose that he was deliberately concealing from his hosts, and her instincts, honed by years of social maneuvering and careful observation of human nature, detected undercurrents of deception that threatened the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so many years. The Duke's obvious lack of interest in Seraphina's considerable charms had been troubling enough, for she had counted upon his presence at the manor to elevate her daughter's social standing, and perhaps even inspire a proposal that would secure the brilliant marriage she had worked so tirelessly to arrange. Yet his complete indifference to the girl's beauty and accomplishments suggested either a level of sophistication that rendered him immune to conventional attractions or the existence of some competing interest that commanded his attention more completely than her daughter's obvious merits. The thought that had begun to torment her sleep and disturb her waking hours was whether the Duke's mysterious absences might somehow be connected to the secret she had guarded so carefully all these years. Whether through coincidence or deliberate investigation, he might have discovered the existence of her troublesome stepdaughter and begun to take an interest in the very person whose complete concealment was essential to all of Lady Constance's plans and ambitions. Her fears crystallized into certainty when Thompson, the footman whose loyalty she had purchased through a combination of bribes and threats, brought her information that confirmed her worst suspicions about the true nature of the Duke's activities during his supposed solitary wanderings. "Your ladyship," Thompson reported in the conspiratorial whisper they had developed for such communications, "I regret to inform you that His Grace has indeed been meeting someone during his walks, though the person in question is not whom you might expect, and the circumstances surrounding these encounters suggest a level of planning and secrecy that indicates deliberate deception rather than innocent coincidence." Lady Constance felt her blood turn to ice in her veins as the footman described witnessing the Duke in earnest conversation with a young woman whose appearance matched exactly the hidden stepdaughter whose very existence threatened everything Lady Constance had worked to achieve. And she realized with growing horror that somehow, despite all her precautions and careful management of information, the one person whose discovery of Cordelia could prove most dangerous to her schemes had not only learned of the girl's existence, but had apparently developed a significant interest in her welfare. The implications of such a development were catastrophic beyond measure. For if the Duke chose to champion Cordelia's cause, or simply made her existence known to the broader society, the entire structure of lies and deceptions upon which Lady Constance had built her daughter's prospects would crumble like a house of cards in a strong wind, leaving her exposed to scandal and ruin that would destroy not only her own position, but Seraphina's chances for the brilliant marriage that represented their only security in an uncertain world. The grandfather clock in Lysander's study struck 11 as he made final preparations for the most audacious undertaking of his adult life. Checking once more the leather satchel that contained legal documents, whose contents would either restore Cordelia Ashworth to her rightful place in society, or expose him to accusations of abduction and improper interference in family affairs that could damage his reputation beyond repair. 3 days had passed since his discovery of Lady Constance's plan to have Cordelia declared incompetent and committed to an asylum. 3 days during which he had worked tirelessly with his solicitors and connections within the legal community to gather evidence of the systematic fraud and abuse that had kept an innocent woman imprisoned in her own home for nearly a decade, while her stepmother embezzled her inheritance and denied her fundamental rights as an adult citizen of England. The documents spread across his mahogany desk represented months of investigation compressed into urgent action, including bank records that proved Lady Constance's unauthorized access to Cordelia's trust funds, forged medical certificates that had been used to justify her continued confinement, and sworn statements from former servants who had been dismissed over the years for showing sympathy to the hidden daughter whose existence threatened the elaborate deception upon which the Ashworth family's current prosperity depended. Yet even with overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing at his disposal, Lysander understood that legal justice would mean nothing if Cordelia remained within her stepmother's power long enough for the commitment proceedings to be initiated. For once, she was declared mentally incompetent by corrupt medical authorities. Proving her sanity and restoring her rights would become exponentially more difficult and time-consuming, assuming it could be accomplished at all, given the prejudices and limitations of a legal system that granted near absolute authority to male relatives in matters concerning women's mental health and financial capacity. The soft knock at his study door announced Mrs. Pemberton's arrival, and Lysander felt his pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety as the moment approached for implementing the rescue plan they had developed through careful consultation over the past 2 days. Weighing risks and contingencies with the thoroughness that had characterized his most important business negotiations, while remaining mindful that they were dealing with a young woman's freedom and perhaps her very sanity rather than mere commercial interests. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly, as she entered the room with the careful composure that had served her well during years of maintaining dangerous secrets, "everything is in readiness at the manor, and Miss Cordelia has been prepared for departure, though I confess she remains somewhat overwhelmed by the suddenness of these developments and the prospect of venturing beyond the only home she has known since childhood." The housekeeper's expression reflected both relief at the approaching end of her long vigil and concern for the psychological challenges that would face someone who had been systematically isolated from normal society for so many formative years, transitions that might prove as difficult to navigate as the immediate physical dangers from which they sought to protect her. "I have packed only essential items to avoid creating suspicion should anyone discover her absence before morning," she continued, "and I have ensured that the household staff scheduled for tonight's duties are those whose loyalty can be trusted absolutely, though we must proceed with utmost caution, for there are still those among the servants who report directly to Lady Constance and would not hesitate to raise an alarm if they suspected what was transpiring." Lysander nodded grimly as he secured the legal documents in his coat pocket, then moved to the window where his carriage waited in the shadows beyond the circular drive, its lamps extinguished and its occupants prepared for a journey that would need to be accomplished with stealth and speed to avoid the consequences of discovery before they reached the safety of his own estate. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said with quiet intensity that reflected the gravity of what they were attempting, "I want you to understand that you are taking considerable personal risk by assisting in this endeavor, and I will not think less of you if you choose to withdraw from our plan rather than face the potential repercussions of Lady Constance's fury when she discovers what has occurred." The older woman straightened her shoulders with dignity that reminded him of her former mistress, whose portrait had first revealed the truth about Cordelia's identity and rightful position, and her voice carried unwavering determination as she replied with conviction that brooked no argument. "Your Grace," she said firmly, "I have served this family faithfully for more than 20 years, but my greatest loyalty has always been to Lady Margaret's memory and to the daughter she entrusted to my care with her dying breath. And I would rather face whatever consequences Lady Constance might devise than continue to participate in the betrayal of that sacred trust by remaining silent while Miss Cordelia suffers injustices that grow more grievous with each passing day. I have watched that sweet child grow into a remarkable woman despite every attempt to crush her spirit and diminish her sense of worth. And if tonight offers the only opportunity to restore her freedom and dignity, then I will gladly risk everything I possess to ensure its success, for some things matter more than personal safety or security." The journey through the darkened corridors of Ashworth Manor felt like navigation through enemy territory as Lysander followed Mrs. Pemberton's lead toward the East Wing, where Cordelia waited with the few possessions she could safely transport, without arousing suspicion among the servants, whose movements throughout the house created constant danger of discovery and exposure. Every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats. Every creaking floorboard sounded unnaturally loud in the silence that surrounded them, and Lysander found himself more thoroughly convinced than ever that the atmosphere of deception and secrecy that permeated this household had corrupted its very foundations with an aura of wrongness that affected everyone who resided within its walls. When they reached Cordelia's chamber, he was struck once again by the contrast between the neglected condition of her surroundings and the evident grace and intelligence of the young woman who rose to greet them, her violet blue eyes reflecting a mixture of excitement, fear, and something approaching disbelief that the moment of liberation she had never dared hope for was finally at hand. She wore the dark traveling dress that Mrs. Pemberton had somehow procured for the occasion, her lustrous hair arranged in a simple style that emphasized the delicate beauty of her features while remaining practical for the journey ahead, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had characterized all their previous encounters despite the obvious emotional turmoil that surrounded this departure from the only life she had ever known. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice trembling only slightly with the magnitude of emotions she struggled to control. "I find myself quite overwhelmed by your generosity and courage in undertaking such risks on my behalf, for I am not certain I possess the strength or wisdom to justify the faith you have placed in my worth and potential for contributing something meaningful to the world beyond these walls." "Miss Ashworth," Lysander replied with gentle firmness that sought to provide reassurance without minimizing the legitimate concerns that any rational person might feel when facing such dramatic changes in circumstances. "You have already demonstrated far more strength and wisdom than you realize simply by surviving years of systematic oppression while maintaining your essential humanity and intellectual curiosity. And I have complete confidence that you will adapt to freedom with the same grace and intelligence you have shown in every aspect of our acquaintance. Tonight is not about proving your worthiness for liberation," he continued with growing warmth, "for that worthiness is inherent in your humanity and requires no justification beyond your basic rights as an adult woman to control her own destiny, but rather about claiming what has always belonged to you by natural law and moral justice, regardless of the illegal machinations that have kept it from you for so long. The legal documents I carry will restore your inheritance and social position. But more importantly, they will confirm what those of us who know you have always understood, that you possess intelligence, character, and accomplishments that would be remarkable in any circumstances, but become truly extraordinary when considered in light of the obstacles you have overcome to achieve them. As they made their way carefully through the manor's service passages toward the concealed exit that Mrs. Pemberton had identified as their safest route to the waiting carriage, Lysander observed how Cordelia moved with increasing confidence as each step took her further from the prison that had confined her spirit as much as her body, though he could also see the effort required for her to master the fear and uncertainty that naturally accompanied such a monumental change in her life's trajectory. The carriage ride to Ravensholm passed in conversation that revealed new depths of Cordelia's character as she asked thoughtful questions about the legal proceedings that would follow her rescue, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the social implications surrounding her emergence into public life, and expressed touching concern for Mrs. Pemberton's welfare and the potential consequences their loyal housekeeper might face for her role in facilitating this dramatic departure from the established order that had governed Ashworth Manor for so many years. Lysander found himself continually impressed by her resilience and practical intelligence as she discussed arrangements for her immediate future with the same analytical approach she had applied to botanical studies, weighing options and considering consequences with remarkable clarity for someone whose entire world had just been transformed overnight. Yet he was equally moved by her vulnerability as she confessed her fears about re-entering a society from which she had been excluded for so long, worrying that she might lack the social graces necessary to navigate drawing rooms and dinner parties, where every gesture carried significance she might not recognize or understand after years of isolation from normal human interaction. "You must understand," she said with characteristic honesty about her limitations and concerns, "that my knowledge of proper etiquette and fashionable conversation comes entirely from books and observation rather than practice, and I fear I may embarrass both myself and those kind enough to sponsor my introduction to polite company through ignorance of conventions that others learned naturally through gradual exposure during their formative years." Miss Ashworth, Lysander assured her with sincerity that sprang from his growing conviction that her natural grace and intelligence would prove more than adequate for any social challenge she might encounter, "I believe you underestimate both your intuitive understanding of human nature and the impression you will make upon those fortunate enough to make your acquaintance, for true breeding and genuine accomplishments have a way of transcending mere technicalities of form and fashion to create respect and admiration that no amount of artificial polish can manufacture in those who lack your essential qualities of character and mind." Moreover, he continued with a smile that reflected both affection and confidence in her abilities, "You will have the advantage of my sister Lady Beatrice's guidance and friendship, for I have already written to inform her of your situation and secure her assistance in helping you adjust to the rhythms and expectations of fashionable society, and I can assure you that you will find no more loyal advocate or skilled mentor in all of England than Beatrice, whose own experiences have given her particular sympathy for those who have faced challenges and overcome adversity through personal strength and determination." As their carriage approached the impressive gates of Ravensholm, Cordelia gazed out at the moonlit landscape of what would become her temporary sanctuary, with wonder that reflected both gratitude for her rescue and anticipation of the new life that was beginning to unfold before her like a flower opening to receive sunlight after a long winter of enforced darkness and constraint. The reunion between Lysander and his sister Lady Beatrice took place in the warmly lit drawing-room of Ravensholm, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the marble hearth and arrangements of fresh flowers created an atmosphere of welcome that immediately put Cordelia at ease, despite her natural nervousness about meeting someone whose good opinion would be crucial to her successful integration into the social world she was about to enter for the first time in her adult life. Lady Beatrice proved to be a woman of perhaps 30 years, whose intelligent dark eyes and warm smile revealed both the family resemblance she shared with her brother and the strength of character that had enabled her to maintain her independence and strong opinions in a society that often discouraged such qualities in women of her station. And her greeting to Cordelia combined genuine warmth with respect that acknowledged the newcomer as an equal rather than an object of charity or condescending sympathy. "My dear Miss Ashworth," Lady Beatrice said, as she rose to embrace Cordelia with natural grace that immediately established their relationship on terms of friendship rather than formal acquaintance. "Lysander has told me something of your circumstances and experiences, though I suspect the full story of your courage and resilience would require far more time to relate properly than we have available tonight. And I want you to know that you are not merely welcome in this house, but treasured as someone whose presence brings honor to our family through your own remarkable qualities and achievements. I understand that the transition from enforced isolation to normal social interaction may seem daunting," she continued, with empathy that sprang from her own experiences of navigating a world that often proved hostile to women who dared to think and act independently. "But I hope you will allow me to serve as both friend and guide as you discover the freedoms and opportunities that are rightfully yours, for I have learned through my own journey that the greatest pleasure in life comes from using our talents and intelligence in service of purposes larger than ourselves, and I believe you will find that your unique perspective and hard-won wisdom will prove invaluable assets in any endeavor you choose to pursue." The warmth of Lady Beatrice's welcome and the security of Lysander's protection combined to create an atmosphere of safety and acceptance that allowed Cordelia to begin relaxing the vigilant self-control that had become second nature during her years of careful concealment and systematic undermining of her confidence and self-worth. For the first time in memory, she found herself in the company of people who valued her thoughts and opinions, not despite her unconventional background, but because of the unique insights and experiences that background had given her, and the sensation of being truly seen and appreciated for her authentic self rather than judged according to standards designed to diminish her sense of worth proved both exhilarating and emotionally overwhelming in ways that brought tears of gratitude to her eyes. As the evening progressed through conversations that ranged from immediate practical concerns about her legal situation to broader discussions of literature, politics, and social reform that revealed the sophisticated thinking of all three participants, Cordelia began to understand that her rescue was not merely an escape from physical confinement, but an entry into a world of intellectual and emotional connections that would challenge her to grow in ways she had never imagined possible during the long years when survival had required the suppression of hopes and dreams that seemed impossibly beyond her reach. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the elegantly appointed sitting room at Ravensholm, as Cordelia stood before the gilt-framed mirror, scarcely recognizing the woman who gazed back at her with wide, violet blue eyes that reflected a mixture of wonder and trepidation at the transformation that had taken place over the past month since her rescue from Ashworth Manor. The gown of deep sapphire silk that Lady Beatrice's modiste had created for her first formal appearance in society fit her slender figure like a second skin, its elegant lines emphasizing the grace and beauty that had been hidden beneath ill-fitting garments for so many years, while her lustrous auburn hair had been arranged in a style that was both fashionable and flattering, crowned with a delicate diamond necklace that had belonged to her mother and been restored to her along with the rest of her rightful inheritance. Yet the most profound changes were not visible in the mirror, for the past weeks had brought a gradual awakening of confidence and self-awareness that was transforming her from the frightened, self-doubting young woman who had fled Ashworth Manor in the dark of night into someone who was beginning to understand her own worth and potential for happiness in ways that years of systematic undermining had made seem impossible. The legal proceedings that had followed her rescue had been swift and decisive, with Lysander's carefully gathered evidence proving so overwhelming that even Sir Reginald had been forced to acknowledge the extent of his wife's deceptions and his own failures as a father, leading to a complete restoration of her inheritance and social position that had left her one of the wealthiest unmarried women in England, though the material benefits of her newfound freedom paled in comparison to the psychological liberation that came from finally being free to make her own choices about her future and her heart. The gentle knock at her door announced Lady Beatrice's arrival, and Cordelia turned from the mirror with a smile that reflected both gratitude for her new friend's unwavering support and nervousness about the evening ahead, when she would make her formal debut at the ball that Lady Beatrice had organized specifically to introduce her to the highest levels of society and establish her rightful place among the town's most respected members. "My dear Cordelia," Lady Beatrice said warmly as she entered the room with the easy familiarity that had developed between them during weeks of shared conversations about everything from literature and politics to fashion and social etiquette. "You look absolutely radiant this evening, and I predict that every gentleman at tonight's gathering will be completely captivated by your beauty and grace, though I suspect there is one particular gentleman whose attention matters more to you than all the others combined." Her knowing smile and meaningful glance toward the windows that overlooked the gardens where Cordelia and Lysander had taken to walking each morning caused a delicate blush to rise in Cordelia's cheeks, for she had not yet found the courage to examine too closely the feelings that had grown between herself and the Duke during their weeks of daily companionship, though she was increasingly aware that what had begun as gratitude and intellectual compatibility had deepened into something far more significant and complex than mere friendship. "Lady Beatrice," Cordelia replied with characteristic honesty about her emotions and uncertainties, "I confess that I find myself quite overwhelmed by the prospect of facing society's scrutiny tonight, for while I have gained confidence in my abilities and worth through your brother's kindness and your own friendship, I cannot help but wonder whether I possess the social graces necessary to navigate the complex expectations and unspoken rules that govern fashionable gatherings, particularly when my own background is so unusual and my introduction to this world has been so sudden and dramatic." Lady Beatrice approached her new friend with the warm expression of someone who understood the challenges facing anyone who dared to enter society under circumstances that defied conventional expectations, and her voice carried both reassurance and conviction as she addressed Cordelia's concerns, with the wisdom born of her own experiences as a woman who had learned to maintain her independence and strong opinions despite social pressures to conform to more traditional roles. "My dear girl," she said gently, placing a comforting hand on Cordelia's arm, "you must remember that true breeding and genuine accomplishments cannot be hidden or diminished by temporary uncertainty about social conventions, and I can assure you that your natural grace and intelligence will serve you far better than any amount of artificial polish could provide, for authentic character always recognizes itself in others and commands respect from those whose opinions are worth having." Moreover, she continued with a smile that held hints of mischief alongside affection, "I have it on excellent authority that at least one gentleman will be watching you with eyes that see only perfection, regardless of any minor missteps you might imagine you could make, and his opinion should carry considerably more weight than the idle chatter of those who lack the wisdom to recognize true worth when it appears before them." The sound of approaching carriage wheels in the circular drive below signaled the arrival of the evening's first guests, and Lady Beatrice moved to the window with obvious satisfaction as she observed the elegant conveyances that were beginning to fill the courtyard with London's most distinguished families, each arriving with expectations and curiosity about the mysterious young woman whose sudden emergence had become the season's most intriguing topic of conversation. As they descended the grand staircase together toward the ballroom where the assembled company awaited their entrance, Cordelia felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reminded her of the night she had first encountered Lysander in the music room at Ashworth Manor, though now she walked openly toward recognition and acceptance rather than fleeing from discovery and potential punishment. The ballroom itself was a vision of elegant splendor, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over walls decorated with fresh flowers and silk hangings, while the assembled guests represented the cream of English society, from political leaders and literary figures to wealthy merchants and titled aristocrats who had come to witness what promised to be one of the most talked-about debuts in recent memory. Yet despite the magnificence of the setting and the importance of the occasion, Cordelia found that her attention was immediately drawn to the tall figure standing near the fireplace, where Lysander waited with an expression of pride and admiration that sent warmth flooding through her chest and reminded her of all the reasons she had grown to treasure his companionship beyond mere gratitude for his rescue from her stepmother's machinations. He wore formal evening attire with the natural elegance that marked him as a gentleman of breeding and substance, but it was the way his grey eyes lit up when they met hers across the crowded room that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart race with emotions she was only beginning to acknowledge and understand. The evening progressed through a carefully orchestrated series of introductions and conversations that gradually revealed the extent to which London society had embraced the romantic story of her rescue and restoration, though Cordelia also detected undercurrents of curiosity and speculation about her background and sudden emergence that reminded her that acceptance in this world would need to be earned through her own conduct and character rather than simply assumed based on her legal status and restored inheritance. Lady Jersey proved particularly gracious in her welcome, praising Cordelia's musical accomplishments and expressing genuine interest in her botanical studies, while Lord Holland engaged her in a sophisticated discussion of contemporary poetry that demonstrated his respect for her intellectual capabilities despite the unconventional nature of her education and background. Yet it was during a quiet moment between formal presentations that Cordelia experienced her first real test of the confidence and self-possession she had been developing under Lady Beatrice's guidance, when Lord Theodore Harrington approached her with an expression of interest that seemed quite different from the dutiful politeness he had shown during his engagement to Seraphina, his manner suggesting that her elevated status and restored fortune had somehow made her worthy of attention that had been invisible to him when she existed only as a hidden family secret. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a smile that was both charming and calculating, "I find myself quite enchanted by your remarkable story and eager to become better acquainted with someone whose accomplishments and beauty have already become legendary throughout London, and I hope you will honor me with your company for the supper dance, as I believe we have much in common and could find considerable enjoyment in each other's society." The invitation presented Cordelia with her first significant choice as a free woman, for she recognized that Lord Theodore represented exactly the sort of conventional security that her stepmother had always claimed was the highest aspiration any woman could achieve. Yet she also sensed that accepting his attentions would mean settling for a life that honored her status and fortune, while potentially ignoring the deeper connections and authentic feelings that had grown between herself and Lysander during their weeks of daily companionship and intellectual partnership. As she considered her response, she became aware of subtle changes in the atmosphere around them, noting how other guests had begun to pay closer attention to their interaction, while Lysander remained engaged in conversation with a group of political figures near the windows, his posture suggesting careful control over whatever emotions her exchange with Lord Theodore might be generating within him. "Lord Harrington," she replied with gracious courtesy that masked her internal deliberations, "I am honored by your invitation and grateful for your kind words about my circumstances, though I confess I find myself rather overwhelmed by the generosity and attention I have received this evening from so many distinguished guests, and I hope you will understand if I reserve the supper dance for quiet conversation with Lady Beatrice, as this represents my first formal introduction to society, and I feel the need for her guidance and support throughout the evening's proceedings." Her polite but firm rejection seemed to surprise Lord Theodore, who had clearly expected that his elevated rank and established position would make his invitation irresistible to someone so recently emerged from obscurity and social isolation. Yet Cordelia felt a surge of satisfaction at having trusted her own instincts rather than accepting an offer that would have been praised by those who valued security above authenticity. The evening's most challenging moment arrived when Seraphina appeared in the ballroom's doorway, her presence creating an immediate stir among the assembled guests who were eager to witness the confrontation between the half-sisters, whose dramatically different fates had become the subject of intense speculation and gossip throughout fashionable London. Seraphina had clearly taken great care with her appearance for this encounter, wearing a gown of pale pink silk that emphasized her conventional prettiness, while jewelry borrowed from her mother's collection sought to maintain some semblance of the elegance she had enjoyed before the scandal surrounding Cordelia's rescue had destroyed her own social prospects and left her engagement dissolved and her reputation in ruins. Yet beneath the surface of her carefully constructed composure, Cordelia could detect signs of the desperation and vulnerability that had driven her half-sister to seek this public confrontation, perhaps hoping that a display of sisterly reconciliation might help restore some measure of social standing, or at least generate sympathy for her own difficult position as an innocent victim of her mother's schemes and deceptions. When Seraphina approached with obvious effort to maintain dignity, despite the curious stares and whispered comments that followed her progress across the ballroom floor, Cordelia felt an unexpected surge of compassion for the young woman who had been raised to believe that her worth depended entirely upon maintaining superiority over others, and who now faced the collapse of everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. "Cordelia," Seraphina said quietly when she reached her half-sister's side, her voice carrying complex emotions that suggested both genuine regret and lingering resentment about the dramatic reversal in their respective fortunes, "I hope you will permit me a few moments of private conversation, for there are things that need to be said between us before too much time pass and the opportunity for honest communication is lost forever." Their withdrawal to a small alcove overlooking the gardens provided the privacy necessary for a conversation that proved to be both painful and healing, as the two young women finally addressed the years of separation and manipulation that had poisoned their relationship and prevented them from developing the natural affection that might have existed between sisters raised under different circumstances. Seraphina's confession came haltingly at first, then with increasing emotional honesty, as she revealed how her mother's constant comparisons and warnings about Cordelia's potential threat to her own prospects had gradually poisoned her mind against the half-sister she had barely known, creating fears and insecurities that had made her complicit in the systematic cruelty that had defined Cordelia's existence for so many years. "I was taught to see you as my enemy rather than my sister," Seraphina admitted with tears beginning to gather in her eyes, "and I convinced myself that your confinement was necessary for my own happiness and security, never questioning whether the stories Mother told about your condition and character were truthful, or recognizing that my success built upon your suffering could never bring genuine satisfaction or peace. Now that I see you as you truly are, accomplished and gracious and beautiful beyond anything I could ever hope to achieve, I understand that I was never competing with you, but with an imaginary threat that existed only in Mother's ambitions and my own fears. And I realized that if I had been strong enough to seek the truth and brave enough to defy Mother's manipulations, we might have been allies and friends rather than strangers separated by lies and deliberate cruelty. The days following Lady Beatrice's successful ball brought an unexpected and deeply troubling change in Lysander's behavior that left Cordelia confused, hurt, and increasingly uncertain about the nature of the feelings that had grown between them during their weeks of companionship and daily conversation at Ravensholm. Where once he had sought her company with obvious pleasure, sharing morning walks through the gardens and evening discussions in the library that had become the brightest moments of each day, he now maintained a polite but distant courtesy that felt like a rejection of the intimacy and understanding they had developed through countless hours of intellectual and emotional connection. His withdrawal was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read the nuances of human behavior through years of careful observation from the shadows, manifesting in shortened conversations that never quite achieved the depth and spontaneity that had characterized their earlier exchanges, in excuses that prevented their usual walks and rides about the estate, and in a general air of careful restraint that suggested he was deliberately maintaining barriers between them for reasons she could not fathom or understand. The change was particularly painful because it coincided with her growing recognition of the true nature of her feelings toward him, emotions that had evolved from gratitude and admiration into something far deeper and more complex that she was only beginning to acknowledge as love, though love of a kind she had never experienced or even imagined during her years of enforced isolation, when such feelings had seemed as impossible and irrelevant as dreams of flying to the moon. She had begun to hope, during those precious weeks when their daily companionship had felt as natural and necessary as breathing, that his attention and obvious pleasure in her society might indicate feelings that matched her own growing attachment. Yet his sudden withdrawal suggested that her emergence into society and the restoration of her inheritance had somehow diminished rather than enhanced her appeal in his eyes. The possibility that tortured her most during long, sleepless nights when she lay staring at the ceiling of her elegant chamber and trying to understand what had changed between them was that Lysander's interest had been motivated primarily by chivalrous protection rather than genuine romantic attachment, and that now that she was no longer a helpless victim requiring rescue, but an independent woman of substantial fortune and established social position, he had lost whatever appeal she might have possessed when she existed as a damsel in distress, whose situation called forth his noble instincts and protective nature. Perhaps, she thought with growing despair, his kindness and attention had been expressions of duty and compassion rather than personal preference, charitable acts performed by a gentleman of honor toward someone whose circumstances demanded assistance, but whose actual company held no particular charm once the drama of rescue had been completed and the satisfaction of justice achieved had removed the motivation for continued involvement in her affairs. The idea that she had mistaken courtesy and responsibility for genuine affection was humiliating enough. But even worse was the possibility that her own transformation from hidden outcast to acknowledged heiress had somehow made her less rather than more worthy of his attention, as though her value had been dependent upon her need for salvation rather than any intrinsic qualities of mind or character that could sustain long-term interest and affection. Lady Beatrice had made several attempts to discuss the situation, clearly recognizing that something was amiss between her brother and her friend, but Cordelia found herself unable to confess the depth of her feelings or the extent of her confusion about Lysander's changed behavior, fearing that speaking her hopes aloud would only make their disappointment more painful and embarrassing when the truth of his indifference became impossible to deny or rationalize away through desperate optimism. For his part, Lysander was wrestling with demons of self-doubt and ethical uncertainty that had plagued him since the night he had orchestrated Cordelia's rescue from Ashworth Manor. Questions about whether his feelings for her could be considered legitimate, given the power imbalance that had existed when they first met, and the gratitude she naturally felt toward someone who had restored her freedom and inheritance after years of imprisonment and abuse. The more he examined his own motivations and emotions, the more he worried that he had taken unfair advantage of her vulnerability and isolation, using his position of authority and influence to gain her affection in ways that compromised her ability to make truly free choices about her romantic attachments and future happiness. The transformation he had witnessed in her confidence and social skills during her first weeks at Ravensholm had been remarkable and gratifying, yet it had also made him increasingly aware of how different their circumstances had been when their relationship began, when she had been entirely dependent upon his protection and assistance, while he had possessed all the advantages of wealth, social position, and worldly experience that made genuine equality between them questionable at best and potentially exploitative at worst. He found himself wondering whether her obvious pleasure in his company sprang from authentic attraction or merely from natural gratitude toward someone who had rescued her from desperate circumstances, and whether the intellectual connection that meant so much to him might seem less appealing to her once she had opportunity to meet other gentlemen who could offer companionship without the complications of obligation and debt that inevitably colored their interactions regardless of his intentions or her conscious thoughts about their relationship. The ethical concerns that tormented his conscience were compounded by practical worries about how society would view their potential union, for while Cordelia's restored inheritance and established social position made her an entirely suitable match from the perspective of wealth and breeding, the dramatic circumstances of their meeting and the romantic story of her rescue had created exactly the sort of public attention and speculation that he had spent years avoiding through his reclusive lifestyle and careful management of his reputation. Marriage to Cordelia would inevitably thrust them both into the spotlight of social curiosity and gossip, exposing her to scrutiny and judgment that might prove uncomfortable for someone still adjusting to life in fashionable society. While his own preference for privacy and discretion would be permanently compromised by the notoriety surrounding their unconventional courtship and the dramatic revelations about her family's deceptions. More troubling still was the possibility that his withdrawal of attention might be causing her pain and confusion, for he could not fail to notice the puzzled hurt in her violet blue eyes during their increasingly infrequent interactions, yet he felt trapped between his desire to spare her the pressure of his expectations and his longing to return to the easy intimacy that had made their daily conversations the brightest part of his existence since her arrival at Ravensholm. Lady Beatrice had made several pointed comments about his changed behavior, clearly disapproving of what she perceived as his retreat from a relationship that had brought obvious happiness to both participants, yet he found himself unable to explain his complex mixture of love, respect, and concern for Cordelia's independence without revealing feelings that might themselves constitute a form of pressure if she felt obligated to respond favorably out of gratitude rather than genuine affection. The situation reached a crisis point when Mrs. Pemberton arrived at Ravensholm for an extended visit, ostensibly to ensure Cordelia's continued adjustment to her new circumstances, but actually at Lady Beatrice's urgent invitation to help resolve the growing tension between her brother and her friend that threatened to destroy the happiness both deserved after years of loneliness and isolation from meaningful companionship. The loyal housekeeper's keen observations and practical wisdom quickly identified the source of the misunderstanding that was keeping two people who clearly loved each other apart through excessive consideration for the other's feelings and welfare, and she joined forces with Lady Beatrice in a campaign to force both parties to confront their emotions honestly rather than continuing to suffer through noble but misguided attempts at self-sacrifice. Their conspiracy took the form of carefully orchestrated circumstances that would require Lysander and Cordelia to spend time alone together without the formal constraints that had characterized their recent interactions. Beginning with a supposed emergency that called Lady Beatrice away from the estate just as Cordelia discovered an injured bird in the gardens that required immediate attention and assistance that only someone with Lysander's knowledge of estate management and animal care could provide. The ruse worked perfectly, bringing them together in the greenhouse where Cordelia tended a small robin with gentle competence that reminded Lysander of all the reasons he had fallen in love with her kindness and intelligence, while the shared activity created opportunities for the natural conversation and easy companionship that they had both missed desperately during the weeks of artificial distance and polite restraint. As they worked together to create a safe recovery space for the injured bird, their conversation gradually returned to the comfortable patterns of intellectual exchange and personal revelation that had characterized their relationship before Lysander's withdrawal, covering topics from animal behavior and natural history to literature and philosophy, with the spontaneity and mutual engagement that had made their daily talks so precious to both participants. Yet beneath the surface pleasure of renewed companionship lay currents of tension and unspoken emotion that neither could ignore indefinitely, particularly when Cordelia finally found courage to address directly the changes she had observed in his behavior and the confusion those changes had created about her place in his life and affections. "Your Grace," she said quietly as they finished arranging comfortable bedding for their small patient, "I hope you will forgive my directness in speaking of personal matters, but I find I can no longer pretend to ignore the distance that has grown between us since my introduction to society, and I must know whether I have somehow offended or disappointed you through my conduct or conversation, for your friendship has meant more to me than I can express, and the thought that I might have damaged it through ignorance or presumption causes me considerable distress." Her honest vulnerability struck him like a physical blow, revealing the extent to which his well-intentioned withdrawal had caused exactly the kind of pain he had hoped to prevent, while her assumption that she might somehow be at fault for the change in their relationship demonstrated how thoroughly her years of systematic undermining had convinced her that disappointment and rejection were her natural lot in life, rather than aberrations to be questioned and resisted. "Miss Ashworth," Lysander replied with sudden intensity that surprised them both with its fervor, "you could never offend or disappoint me through any action or word within your power to control, for your character and accomplishments have exceeded my highest expectations and most optimistic hopes from the moment of our first meeting in the music room at Ashworth Manor, and if there has been distance between us these past weeks, the fault lies entirely with my own fears and uncertainties rather than any deficiency in your conduct or conversation." He moved closer to where she stood, beside the makeshift recovery cage, his grey eyes reflecting emotions he had struggled to suppress during their separation, as he continued with growing passion and conviction. "I have withdrawn from our friendship not because your company had become less precious to me, but because I began to fear that my feelings might compromise your freedom to make independent choices about your future, for I could not bear the thought that gratitude or obligation might influence your heart in ways that prevented you from discovering your true preferences and desires without the pressure of my expectations and hopes. The truth is that I have fallen so completely in love with you that I feared my presence might constitute a form of coercion that would deny you the opportunity to explore other attachments and possibilities that might bring you greater happiness than anything I could offer, despite my own desperate longing to return to the intimacy and understanding that made our daily conversations the most precious hours of my existence. His confession hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of misunderstanding and fear that had separated them for so many painful weeks. and Cordelia felt her heart race with a mixture of joy, relief, and incredulous wonder that the feelings she had harbored in secret were not only reciprocated, but had motivated his withdrawal rather than being destroyed by it. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotions she no longer felt the need to hide or suppress. "You speak of coercion and obligation as though my feelings toward you could be anything but freely chosen and genuinely felt. Yet I must tell you that what I experienced during our separation was not liberation, but desolation. For I had grown to depend upon your companionship not from gratitude alone, but from recognition that in you I had found someone whose mind complemented my own, and whose character called forth the best aspects of my nature in ways that made me feel fully alive for the first time in my adult life. If there has been coercion in our relationship, it has been the sweet coercion of intellectual equality and emotional understanding that made your absence feel like the loss of some essential part of myself. And if you withdrew from fear of influencing my choices, I must tell you that the only choice I wish to make is to spend my life in the company of someone who saw my worth when I was hidden and despised, who valued my thoughts when society declared me mad, and who loved my true nature before the world recognized my external beauty or social position." The garden around them seemed to hold its breath as they stood facing each other in the golden light of late afternoon, both finally free to speak the truth that had been growing in their hearts despite every obstacle and misunderstanding that had threatened to keep them apart. While the injured bird chirped softly in its cage, as though offering benediction on their mutual recognition and acceptance of the love that had transformed them both from isolated individuals into partners capable of creating beauty and meaning together. The rose garden at Ravensholm had been transformed into something approaching paradise through the efforts of a dozen skilled gardeners working under Lysander's direction to recreate the sanctuary that had been Cordelia's refuge during her years of imprisonment at Ashworth Manor, though this new version surpassed its model through careful planning and resources that allowed each variety of rose to flourish in optimal conditions, while architectural features and artistic elements created a setting worthy of the most important ceremony of their lives. As Cordelia walked down the petal-strewn pathway toward the rose-covered arbor where Lysander waited with the minister who would perform their marriage ceremony, she wore her mother's wedding gown altered to fit her perfectly, its ivory silk and delicate lace catching the morning sunlight as though she were clothed in captured starlight and spring rain, while the diamond necklace that had been Lady Margaret's pride sparkled at her throat like frozen tears of joy shed by someone whose greatest dream was being fulfilled beyond anything she had dared to imagine during her lifetime of struggle and sacrifice. The assembled guests represented not only the highest levels of society, but also the personal connections that had made their love story possible, from Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Pemberton, whose conspiracy had brought them together, to Sir Reginald, whose guilt and shame had motivated genuine efforts at reconciliation and reform, and even Seraphina, who had used the scandal surrounding her mother's exposure to forge a new path based on honest work and authentic relationships rather than the artificial superiority that had characterized her youth. The ceremony itself was both intimate and profound, with vows that acknowledged the extraordinary journey that had brought them from their first mysterious meeting to this moment of public commitment and private joy, while the setting among Lady Margaret's roses seemed to offer the blessing of the woman whose love had created the sanctuary where her daughter first learned to tend growing things, and whose memory had sustained Cordelia through years of doubt and despair. When Lysander spoke his vows, his voice carried conviction that reached every corner of the garden as he promised to honor not only Cordelia's beauty, but the intelligence, courage, and compassion that had captured his heart, while her response demonstrated the confidence and grace that had emerged from years of hidden growth finally given opportunity to flourish in the sunlight of recognition and love. As they exchanged rings that symbolized their commitment to face whatever challenges life might bring as equal partners rather than rescuer and rescued, protector and protected, the assembled guests witnessed not just a wedding but the culmination of a transformation that had revealed the true faces of two people who had learned to see and be seen without fear, pretense, or the need to diminish themselves or others in pursuit of happiness that honored their authentic natures and shared values. 6 months later, as autumn painted the gardens of Ravensholm in shades of gold and crimson, Cordelia knelt among the roses she now tended openly as mistress of the estate, rather than in secret as a hidden daughter seeking solace in forbidden beauty, her hands gentle but confident as she pruned and shaped the plants that would bloom again in spring with renewed vigor and enhanced glory. Lysander approached through the morning mist with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose greatest gamble had yielded rewards beyond calculation or expectation. His love and respect for his wife evident in every gesture as he joined her in the work that had become their shared passion and symbol of the life they were creating together through patience, wisdom, and mutual devotion. The transformation was complete, yet it had revealed, rather than created, the beauty that had always existed within both of them, waiting for the courage to emerge and the wisdom to recognize its reflection in another soul, brave enough to show their true face to the world and claim the happiness that was their birthright as human beings capable of love, that honors rather than diminishes, that reveals rather than conceals, and that grows stronger through the challenges that test its authenticity and depth.